Hello, everyone. Welcome to Exploring the Quran and the Bible. I'm really excited about this episode in which I speak with the one and only Professor Ahmad Al-Jallad of The Ohio State University, and we discuss about his incredible work in recent years in regard to pre-Islamic Arabian epigraphy or inscriptions, his fieldwork in Saudi Arabia and in Jordan, and above all, the implications of his discoveries of these inscriptions for our knowledge of early Islam, the Quran, and the context of the rise of Islam. In particular, and this is pretty exciting, I don't want to give too much away, we discuss a recent field expedition that he conducted and in his analysis of an inscription in the Hijaz, very close to Mecca, which dates just before the time of Islam, most likely, and has interesting implications for knowledge of the Quran. So I hope you enjoy this episode. Thanks for your support. Of course, we're not asking for financial support, but you can support us simply by subscribing and liking this channel and spread the news to everyone, your friends and your enemies. Thank you.
Well, hello, Ahmad Al-Jallad. It's great to be with you.
Hello, nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
I'm so happy to have this chance, and really it means a lot to me that you'll take some time to be with us on this discussion for the channel Exploring the Quran and the Bible. I'm going to start with a semi-formal introduction, and then we'll move right into the questions, if that's okay.
Sure.
All right, super. So everyone, probably Ahmad Al-Jallad needs no introduction, but he is the Sophia Chair in Arabic Studies at The Ohio State University. I learned to emphasize the from others and from watching football games. He is a philologist, epigraphist, and historian of language. His work focuses on the languages, writing systems, religions, and history of pre-Islamic Arabia and the ancient Near East. There's so many great publications that have shaped the way people are thinking about the context of the rise of Islam, but also the long history of the Arabic language. So I've picked out a few. Maybe there's some you'd like to emphasize, but it's published in 2020. So just some recent works, influential ones, The Linguistic Landscape of Pre-Islamic Arabia. And I think that's in an Oxford handbook. Is that right?
Yeah, that's in the handbook of the Quran.
Okay,
yeah.
Terrific. And then just this year, 2021, a really influential article for, I think, the Journal of the Royal Asiatic Society on the origins of the god Rudau and some remarks on the pre-Islamic North Arabian pantheon. And then there's a draft article that's up on academia, if it's okay. I mentioned it's the pre-Islamic Basmala, reflections on its first epigraphic attestation and its original significance.
Yes.
So that's, had been a big hit on academia and has, we'll have a chance to speak about the implications of it, but a really important consideration of a South Arabian inscription. Any other publications I should mention there, Ahmed?
I think you've covered them. Thank you.
Some key ones. Yeah, there's so many. So I really encourage everyone to get to know the work of Professor Al-Jallad, and we'll have, just a casual conversation about some general background to your work, but also some specific case studies that I hope will sort of shine light on your method and the importance of your research. So let's start with a more sort of biographic business, and if you, could share with our viewers how you entered into the field of Arabic studies and specifically inscription, so Arabic epigraphy and linguistics. Yeah, how did it all start, and how did it progress?
Well, I think it started with my discovery of the field of historical linguistics, which is the comparative study of languages with the goal of reconstructing their prehistoric past. So, and it's, I would say, for me, that appealed to me. It was very exciting to be able to construct a past that we didn't have access to in any other way. So by looking at different cognate languages, we could know what their ancestor looked like by applying the comparative method.
Right.
And so in graduate school, I started studying Semitic languages, interested in knowing what the earliest, what we would call Proto-Semitic is, the ancestor of all the Semitic languages, of which Arabic is included. But at the same time, I was interested in reconstructions that were a little bit more shallow in time. So for example, what would the prehistoric ancestor of all the languages that we call Arabic today look like? So we have classical Arabic, which broadly speaking includes the language of the pre-Islamic poems, the literary language of Islamic civilization.
Right.
We have Quranic Arabic, which usually falls under the category of classical Arabic, but has its own peculiarities. Then you have the dozens and dozens of modern dialects and medieval dialects. So if we look at all of these languages and apply the comparative method, what can we say about their common ancestor? Mm-hmm. And then, so I was interested in that. And then in graduate school, I discovered the ancient North Arabian inscriptions. And these are pre-Islamic inscriptions carved on stone stretching from the Syrian desert to Yemen. And what fascinated me about these inscriptions is that they were still so poorly understood, and they still are today too. But these inscriptions felt like they had the potential of transforming Arabic's prehistoric past into history. In other words, what I was trying to reconstruct may not have necessarily been as necessary, because there were witnesses to the time period that I was trying to reconstruct to. So if you take the analogy with dinosaurs, I was busy trying to reconstruct dinosaur bones, reconstruct dinosaurs by comparing modern living animals, but then the fossils were actually there.
We're there, right.
Yes, and so I became interested in going and digging up those fossils, finding those fossils, digging them up, reassembling them, and trying to figure out what Arabic looked like 2,000 years ago, what Arabic looked like 3,000 years ago, not by reconstruction or full reconstruction. We say we always have to reconstruct the past in some kind of way, but by actually looking at evidence of the language from those time periods.
Were there people you met during your graduate school career or soon thereafter who were doing this work already, who sort of mentored you, or yeah?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I would say that my graduate advisor, my teacher, John Hunegard, was aware of this material and encouraged looking at it, of course, but he wasn't a specialist of this particular material itself. But I would say that I read and committed to memory article after article of Michael McDonald.
Right.
And then I had a chance to meet him in 2011 at a conference, and I just expressed my desire to study this subject and to learn this material. And he was very gracious to communicate with me through email, through phone calls, and even allowed me to come visit him. And basically, he taught me one-on-one the elements of reading these inscriptions and trying to interpret them and understand them in their historical context. And there is a long line of people, of course, before Michael, most of whom have passed away, though, that have been busy with these inscriptions. And so I would say I benefited a lot from this mentorship. I consider Michael McDonald my teacher as well, and also a dear friend. And he did pioneering work on trying to understand what these inscriptions mean in their historical context, because you may learn the alphabet and read in text, but you're still only halfway there. Because if we turn only to medieval Arabic dictionaries, we might not get the sense of the inscription as it was carved 1,000 years before, Al-Khalil compiled the first Arabic lexicon.
Right. I think that's a really good point. People might think that we're concerned with inscriptions that were from just before the rise of Islam, but some of these are very ancient, centuries before that.
Absolutely. In fact, the oldest, they're sometimes very hard to date because their authors didn't date their inscriptions with us in mind. So someone might date their inscription to the year so-and-so died. Of course, everyone in his context knew who this so-and-so was. But for us, we're lost in time. But there is perhaps the oldest one of these inscriptions. It was published in 2015, so it's quite a new discovery. It was published by Hani Hayajni and some colleagues. The inscription it comes from Bayr in Jordan, and it's a simple invocation. It begins with Ha, Malkom, wa Kemosh, wa Qaus, Bikum awadna. So, O Malkom, Kemosh, and Qaus, in you we have sought refuge. So anyone who knows Arabic liturgical phraseology sees a similarity here with the use of the verb awada. Yeah. But the three gods are the gods of the Canaanite Transjordanian kingdoms, right? So Ammon, Moab, and Edom. And the mentioning of all three together probably suggests this text comes from the early first millennium BCE. So we're talking about 3,000 years ago. Okay. Of course, it's give or take a century that we have to deal with that kind of margin of error, but it's extremely, extremely old.
Yeah. So did you have a natural, we're going to return to some of the sort of intellectual academic question, but did you have a natural fascination, excitement about the notion of going out on excavations and, being in the Jordanian or in other contexts, looking at rocks. Must be like at times sort of boring, tedious work, maybe less exciting than it seems from, I don't know.
It's never boring for me.
Okay.
And every inscription is we sometimes joke and say, oh, this is a boring inscription, it's just names, but every inscription has value. Every inscription can contribute to our understanding of the past, even if it's just names. I think I didn't, before I started studying this material, I love the outdoors. So this is a bonus, but I didn't study, of course, archaeology, which would have kept me in the field. I was sort of drawn into this from the language aspect, but once I got out into the field, I fell in love with it. I fell in love with the experience of discovery. There are, it's probably one of the greatest joys in life to discover something truly unique, to be the first person to look and read something that has been forgotten for thousands of years. And then being able to take that and use it to shed light on a period of history that is of interest to everyone, and a period of history that is so dark still. So I found that experience basically drawing me in, and I absolutely am in love with fieldwork. Yeah.
Maybe this is a silly question, but how do you find an inscription? Like if you have a region in mind, okay, so that's a starting point, and you know where to take the to drive your rental car or your Jeep or whatever it is out there. But then like you're out there in the desert or the steppe or something.
Yeah.
How do you find an inscription? Do you start looking for places where there were likely water sources at some point, or?
Yeah, there are those clues. Basically, an inscription will be anywhere that would allow people to spend time. But that doesn't guarantee the existence of an inscription. Shade is very important. So if you can find places that are in valleys, maybe where you could pasture your animals and where there's shade that can attract individuals to write an inscription, but you can pick an area. And I've had colleagues who've done this. They'll sort out an area and survey for weeks and find 2 or 3 texts. To call it a needle in a haystack it wouldn't be an exaggeration. So much of finding it serendipity, to be honest with you. It's you have to feel it somehow, and I don't know really how to explain it, because it's
more an art than a science, or?
Yeah, there's an art to it. I mean, when during my last survey in Saudi Arabia, which we'll talk about later, so much of our greatest discoveries were made because we got clues from locals. We would ask locals, someone who knows the land. You have to rely on the assistance of locals who know the landscape. Have you seen strange markings like this? Have you seen?
That's a really good point. Sure.
Yeah.
Yes.
The locals who live there. We were working with a Bedouin man who basically pastured his animals in this huge area, and he knows, and it's incredible because that's his home. So he'll say, yes, I think on that rock over there are some texts that I've seen, and about a kilometer that way on that rock, and so we'll follow him. But once you identify an area where there are inscriptions, what you must do is sweep it meter by meter to make sure that you get everything. We went into these beautiful mountains south of Taif, gorgeous paradise, really. Absolutely. In Saudi Arabia. Yes, precisely. So south of Taif, these beautiful mountainous areas. We went into one of these gorgeous mountains called Jabal Qarnait. It's about 2,500 meters high, forested, absolute paradise. The weather in August was about 25 degrees Celsius. So it was just amazing, the place you want to be. And we spent almost the entire day there looking, and there were no inscriptions at all. Nobody, not ancient and not modern. I guess the landscape is too beautiful. You don't want to spend time carving. Whereas you go south, go to the west and south into the most inhospitable terrain you can imagine. 51, 52 degrees Celsius, winds blasting superheated sand into your face, and there are inscriptions.
Right.
And we were able to find from rock to rock texts. So sometimes even that formula of where would people like to spend time doesn't necessarily equal where you might find inscriptions. I don't have a science for it. You go, you talk to locals, you look at maps, and you have to basically just feel it.
Got it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, yeah, we look forward to hearing more about what you found in Saudi Arabia. But before, if I can take a diversion from our talk of inscriptions, you mentioned you like the outdoors, and I always like to hear what people do outside of their research.
Okay.
So yeah, is there, well, maybe one way to approach it is, was there an alternative career path you once had in mind? Was there another direction your life might have taken? And are there other things outside of academia that are like sources of fun and relaxation in your life?
Well, maybe a little bit from my scholarship, how I tend to try to stay away from speculation. And so I have no idea about what other paths could have been there, but I do enjoy the outdoors, and especially during Corona, I got to spend a lot of time outside. I liked hiking, fishing, and one thing that I really enjoyed doing was fossil collecting. And so, believe it or not, in Ohio,
here in North America, yeah.
In Ohio, there are excellent places to go fossil collecting.
Yeah, super. Well, okay, let's go from fossils and remnants of Precambrian life back to back to life as a linguist. And can we start with the Arabic language? And I'll start sort of on a basic level, because viewers will be coming from all sorts of with all sorts of backgrounds to this. Arabic, as you've already mentioned, is a Semitic language. You mentioned your interest in something called Proto-Semitic or Ur-Semitic. So could you just introduce us generally to how languages are classified, and maybe just give us like a brief overview to the Semitic language family?
Right. So Semitic is a modern scholarly invention. We have no evidence that any people who speak Semitic languages ever in the past called their languages Semitic, and that the speakers of the very first Semitic language that we would think of called Proto-Semitic would have called their language Semitic. This is a useful, it's modern nomenclature, and it just allows us to speak easily about a group of languages that are centered in the Middle East, but now, of course, have spread far beyond. That share certain grammatical and lexical features in common, such that those similarities cannot be explained by chance or contact, but must reflect descent from a single ancestor. And what happens is, over time, as language is transmitted between generation to generation, certain mutations happen to that language, and they start to diversify, especially if the speakers are no longer in contact with each other. And when we look at languages then that are all related and pay attention to the features that suggest that they're all related, but also to the features that make them different, we can draw sort of a family tree. And the nodes on that tree suggest a period in time where their speakers split, probably geographically, or they just no longer were in close contact with each other, and that the mutations that accumulated in their spoken language over time happened independently, and therefore we can speak of discrete languages. Now, what we call each node on that tree is also just a matter of scientific nomenclature. It's not a statement of ethnicity, it's not a statement of identity, but it's simply a way that linguists can say that all the languages that belong under this node and share an ancestor to the exclusion of all the other languages can be known by this name. Mm-hmm. So when we use the term Proto-Arabic, what we're basically saying is, what is the most recent common ancestor that partook in the linguistic developments, the grammatical developments that we find in all the languages that we today call Arabic.
Right.
And that would include classical Arabic, that would include Quranic Arabic, that would include the dialects of the ancient poems, as well as all the modern spoken dialects. And so basically it's like calling something a mammal. If it has fur, if it gives live birth, if it produces milk for its offsprings, it's a mammal. Okay, that's the term we give to it. Of course, mammals aren't walking around thinking of themselves as mammals, but we can see from a point of classification that they all have something in common, to the exclusion of reptiles. So when we look at ancient languages too, ancient inscriptions, sometimes we find inscriptions that share all of these developments with something that we call Arabic, and that would be put in the same category as Arabic. And then we may come across other inscriptions that don't. they have different mutations, they have different features. And those inscriptions also may be in Arabia, but they won't be classified as Arabic as such.
So a case here might be the ancient South Arabian languages.
Precisely.
So not be within the Arabic language family or.
Precisely. So when we look at the languages of ancient Yemen, their grammatical features look like they took a different path of development. And they are not part of the same family of languages that we call Arabic. And one might argue, well, why don't you just change the definition of the family then? Why don't you just make it wide enough to include the ancient South Arabian languages? Which you can do. You can, rename anything you like. You just move up a node. But if we move up a node and rename the higher node Arabic to include the ancient South Arabian languages, we have at the same time included Aramaic and Hebrew and Ugaritic and all these other languages into some group we call Arabic, and then the label has no meaning anymore.
Right.
It just basically means everything. So basically Arabic is about, in terms of its relatedness, looking at these mutations, it's about equidistant from let's say Sabaic and Hebrew. So it's as related to Sabaic as it is related to Hebrew, as it is to Aramaic.
Interesting. Yeah, Sabaic being one of the ancient South Arabian languages.
Precisely, the principal language of ancient Yemen. Yeah.
Okay. Right. So I don't know if this is doing things backwards, but it's a question that might interest Arabic speakers today, which is there's a notion out there that the Arabic dialects, so if you hear someone speaking Moroccan or Lebanese or Iraqi, Arabic, immediately, even an introductory student of Arabic will recognize how different it is. It's maddening for non-Arabic speakers trying to learn the language. They learn some modern standard Arabic, and then they actually go to Morocco or Lebanon or Iraq, and they're like, what the heck are people speaking here? But there's this common notion that these dialects are somehow like vulgarizations and simplifications of classical Arabic.
Right.
But I think the story is more complicated than that. Could you comment briefly on that, the relationship?
Yeah, sure. Well, simplification is always depends on what grammatical feature you're talking about. So one might say that the dialects are a simplification of classical Arabic if you pay attention to nominal inflection, the case endings, for example.
Right.
But if you look at negation, something like Egyptian Arabic has a much more complicated system of negation and of putting words together into bigger words than classical Arabic does. So there's no such thing as complete simplification, but rather languages change over time. And in some respects, they simplify an inherited let's say, a group of features, and then sometimes they actually become more complex. But the relationship between the modern dialects and what we're calling classical Arabic is very complicated, simply because what we call classical Arabic is a simplifying definition. What do we mean exactly by classical Arabic? Do we mean the language of Imra al-Qais's poem? Because if we look at that lexically and even grammatically, it's quite different than the language that people are using to draw up contracts in the Umayyad period.
Good point. Right.
So it's just a huge label. And ultimately, when we deal with classical Arabic in the Abbasid period as a written language, many people writing this are using it simply as a literary language. They are from Central Asia or elsewhere. And literary languages are not the ancestors of spoken languages. So they sort of exist in parallel timelines. You have a literary register that exists in one timeline, and of course you have vernaculars that exist in another timeline. And if you go back far enough, perhaps the literary register was much closer to the vernacular, and they diverged over time. But the relationship between vernaculars is never one of being a direct descendant of a literary language, because we don't learn literary languages from our parents, from our mothers at home. And that is the way that's where we learn a vernacular. And so the changes that accumulate and cause vernaculars to change over time happen independently of what's going on in the world of literary languages.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I feel like we should also discuss maybe just briefly, and probably we won't be able to do it justice, but the question of Arabic at the time of Islam's origins. Before we get to the Quran, I have some Quran questions, as you might guess.
Sure.
So this is an old debate, the nature of Arabic at the time, and two German scholars, Theodor Nödeke and Karl Wohlers, had a lively debate about the question of classical Arabiya and whether it was a spoken language, whether inflected language was spoken language. It's been ongoing, and there's all sorts of debates that have unfolded among more recent scholars. John Wansbrough had his own opinion about this in his book Quranic Studies, I think in part 4. What would you say are some of the questions that are still debated about the nature of Arabic, of Arabiya, relationship between the poetic language and the spoken language? I know it's a really broad question, so anything you'd like to add on that point?
Well, I'll approach it, like I said earlier, I like to stay away from speculation. So I'll approach it from the coming forward in time where we have evidence. So if we look at the situation of Arabic 2,000 years ago, we have such an abundance of texts that range from the Syrian desert all the way into the Hijaz, Najd, and further south. So many texts. And what we can see 2,000 years ago from these inscriptions, and most of them are using a formulaic language, that there is such a diversity, a huge diversity in the kind of Arabic that exists at the time. So there's already a lot of dialectal diversity 2,000 years ago. So, for example, in the Safvidic inscriptions, which are located in basically in the Black Desert, the Basalt Desert on the border of Syria and Jordan that extends into Saudi Arabia, in this relatively small area, you have just from the inscriptions themselves that are all actually saying the same thing. So we don't get a window even into the kind of dialectal diversity that exists. But even by saying the same things, we see there's a huge amount of synonyms being used. We see there's a lot of grammatical differences. So for example, some verbs that end in a ya, like baka, bakaya, he wept. Sometimes they'll be written with, or let's use ataya, he went, ataya. Sometimes it's written atawa with a wow, and sometimes just ata. So it already shows that you have 3 different pronunciations of the same verb in the same area. My favorite example, in fact, is the diversity of definite articles, the word for the. So there was a guy called Hamlet, or Hamlet in English, and he was a bandit, and he wrote an inscription identifying himself as a bandit. And in one inscription he wrote li Hamlet halist. Right? The bandit list, which gives you lusts in Arabic. It ultimately comes from Greek. And he gives the definite article there as list.
Right.
Then the same guy writes an inscription later. He found the same guy, he writes the same inscription. He says, Li Hamlet al-list, with the al-definite article. So in his dialect, he basically had 2 forms of the definite article that he could interchange, depending on the mood, perhaps. And we see in the Safvidic inscriptions the same thing. Sometimes they use ha, sometimes they just use a, sometimes they use al. So there's a lot of dialectal diversity. And the same can be said throughout Arabia. And the reason why you encounter so much diversity like this is because there's no pan-Arabian political order that is giving official sanction to one kind of Arabic. So what ends up showing in the inscriptions is diversity.
And now maybe also no canonical text or scripture which would establish sort of certain norms that would become authoritative.
Precisely. Now, there's no doubt that they had a rich oral literature, but perhaps the verbatim preservation of their poems and their tales or whatever wasn't so important, so that there was more lexicon. So even if we look at the pre-Islamic poems, and we look at different recensions of the pre-Islamic poems, there's a lot of flexibility in vocabulary, in grammatical structure, and perhaps even in pronunciation. We can't see that from our distance. But let's move forward in time. So that's around 2,000 years ago. Let's move to the 6th century, the century before the rise of Islam. In the 6th century, there is now an explosion of Arabic script inscriptions from the 6th century. These are being discovered all the time because there's a lot of interest in the subject and people are going out and looking and exploring places. Right. And what's remarkable is that you have the use in the 6th century of basically one script from Yemen to Syria. Okay, from the border, from the edge of Yemen to Syria. But what you don't have is a single writing tradition. So there's a lot of variation in orthography and the way people wrote. There's a lot of variation in phraseology. They don't look like the inscriptions. If we go forward just one more century to the end of the 7th century, the 8th century, there's incredible uniformity.
Standardization, yes.
Standardization. A century earlier, there isn't standardization. So when we ask the question of what Arabic was like at the dawn, during the or at the beginning of Islam, at the dawn of Islam, the question itself supposes that there is one kind of Arabic. And in fact, there was probably a huge diversity of Arabic. That's what the inscriptions are showing us.
Okay.
And so we might ask the question, what was the compositional dialect of the Quran?
Okay.
And how did that dialect relate to other forms of Arabic around it? So the question here is, did the Quran have the same kind of grammatical nominal inflection that the language of the poems that were produced nearly in the same time had? And that's the question that I think people are researching. You have, of course, some of the most recent work done by Marijn van Putten, who's looking very closely at the Quranic Rasm and trying to see if he can extract evidence of the compositional dialect from that, right? So I think essentially what we can see too is that the way that the Quran is spelled, the use of the script and the orthography of the Quran looks very different in some respects to 6th century Arabic inscriptions. Okay. So it seems perhaps to reflect a writing school of Arabic that was centered maybe in the Hijaz, that's different from the writing school that was at Najran, that was different from the writing school at Duma or in Syria. And there would have been nothing to unify these different writing schools until the emergence of a single political order with the Medinian state.
That's a really interesting point. Okay. And you mentioned that all of the scripts are essentially similar, and that's because what's used in the 6th century inscriptions is this late form of Nabatean writing that eventually is adopted for Arabic.
Yes, and this point here is actually a subject of a small blog post I wrote for ICSA that should come out soon. So if we take two maps, if we take a map of the languages and scripts of Arabia from 2,000 years ago, it is characterized by diversity. Almost every region had its own script. Dialectal diversity was widespread. Linguistic diversity, where you had several different languages being used all around the peninsula. The map is incredibly diverse. The map's legend has maybe 13 points to kind of show you how much diversity is there. Now, when you move to the 6th century, all of those scripts disappear. And you have one script, which is the Arabic script, which itself is simply the latest stage of the Nabatean Aramaic script. So something happened between that period that led to cultural uniformity. Something emerged between those centuries, those 500 years, those 5 centuries, that reduced all of that script variation into one single script. And it's being used across the peninsula. And so you would think that that comes also with the emergence of a more unified identity, perhaps. In addition to that, all of these different languages that were used throughout these regions seem to have been replaced by the language of the Arabic script, which is Arabic. Now, there's still variation. Like I said, there's different writing schools, but something happened in between these centuries that led to this kind of this let's say, homogeneous map. And that's the historical question, because we can speculate a bit on.
This is before Islam. We're not speaking about the rise of Islam. We're speaking of, yes. Yeah. Precisely
before Islam, something led to this homogenization, and we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
But that it happened is undeniable. Just look at two maps separated by 500 years. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Well, we could, I could ask many more questions about the nature of the Arabic language at the dawn of Islam. Well, this is related really, because I want to turn to the Quran now, and it raises a point which is connected to what we were speaking about, in that is the nature of Arabic, but also bilingualism or multilingualism in the context of Arabia at the dawn of Islam. And maybe I'll just focus on one particular term in the Quran, which is Quran. And just to remind our viewers, so, the scripture of Islam doesn't say in so many words that, or present its title as the Quran or Al-Quran, but rather there are autoreferential or self-referential passages in the Quran which speak about the Prophet's proclamations as Al-Quran, which is an Arabic word that has meaning, usually understood to be something like the recitation or the proclamation. It seems to be related, of course, to the root qara'a, having to do with reading or reciting. Famously, by tradition, the first revelation to the Prophet is Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, the beginning of Surah Al-Alaq or Surah 96 of the Quran. So it has the Iqra there sharing the same root. And yet there's the old theory that there's the bit about the end of the word Quran, this Alif Nun, which maybe has something in common with the nominal structure, not of Arabic, but of Aramaic. And
right.
So, the old theory is that Quran is related to this Aramaic, or specifically Christian Aramaic or Syriac term, Keryana, or Keryono, depending on your pronunciation, which is used for the book of liturgical readings or the lectionary in the Christian context. So I don't know if you want to comment on that question in particular, and maybe speak about bilingualism in the Arabian context, specifically Aramaic-Arabic bilingualism.
Right. Well, I think we can begin with when can we say Arabic and Aramaic come into contact? Because a lot of in many ways, people who've looked at words that have an Aramaic etymology in the Quran, they assume that these were imported, borrowed by the Prophet himself, or in that historical context. Now, Aramaic is first introduced into Arabia, or well, we can't say, let's say a big introduction. Somebody who brought Aramaic with them into Arabia was King Nabonidus, the last king of Babylon. In the middle of the 6th century BCE.
This is a long time before.
Yes, 6th century BCE. He invades Arabia, occupies Tema, and marches as far south as Yathrib. And all along in this period, we see
Yathrib,
that Aramaic.
Sorry to throw you off there, Ahmed, but just to mention, in case anyone doesn't know, Yathrib becomes, with the rise of Islam, the city known as Medina. So yeah.
Yes. So middle of the 6th century BCE, Nabonidus makes it as far as Yathrib, and he has his entourage of administrators and what have you. And we see that Aramaic is introduced in a big way to Arabia in this time period. Aramaic becomes, or there are public inscriptions at Tema in Aramaic. Later on, going forward in time, big oasis, the kingdom of Lihyan, which is at the end of the 1st millennium BCE in the Hijaz. Their kings are using Aramaic. There are Aramaic inscriptions there. The Nabateans, who are have an Arabic-speaking elite, an Arabic-speaking, let's say, kingdom centered in the northern Hijaz, southern Levant, with their capital at Petra. They are using Aramaic as an administrative language. They're using Aramaic as a language of business, and they control as far east as Dumat al-Jandal, and it seems as far south as Yathrib. And they are, that is Medina. And so Aramaic is actually in Arabia for centuries and centuries and centuries before the rise of Islam. And that's important because when you have that kind of early contact, you may absorb words and no longer recognize them as loanwords anymore. So for example, most English speakers don't think they're using a foreign word when they say restaurant. It's an English word. Most English speakers have no idea of its etymology. So we know that, in fact, the words qara'a and kataba are likely, we have to think about these words come with a technology. See, writing is a kind of technology.
That's a good point.
And when you bring over that technology, what you also often bring over is the technical vocabulary associated with that technology. Right? So, people who are using social media today in Arabic, they say, "Ana ba'mal like," to mean that you like something. It's the word is brought over part of the with the medium as part of the technology. And so these words we see already in Safaitic that both qara'a and kataba are already present in these Arabian languages. You have curses and prayers and curses. Salam liman qara'aha kitab wa awwar man awwar. So may the one who would read this writing be secure, but blind the one who faces it. And so you have qara and kataba already as a pair 2,000 years ago. So looking at the Quran, I would say that this is the verb qara'a and probably its derivatives, as well as the verb kataba, are already entrenched in Arabic. They're already very much part of Arabic, and it would be shocking if its audience thought or heard these words and thought that they were foreign. What's interesting, though, is that both verbs, qara'a and kataba, seem to be very closely attached to the Aramaic writing tradition. That is, writing in Nabatean Aramaic. In South Arabian, the verb of writing is satara. And there you have the asatir al-awwalin.
Yeah.
Absolutely. In
So there's
Safaitic,
no connection. Sorry, this is just a little tangent, everyone. Be patient with me. So yeah, Asatir al-Awwalin, no connection then with Latin or Greek and the notion of where we get the English word story, French histoire.
right, right. Well, I would think that I don't know if this is true, but it may be significant that they're using the South Arabian verb for writing, and in fact, the most ancient monuments around, which are called satar, the most ancient monuments around are South Arabian.
Okay.
And so when you talk about Asatir al-Awwalin, it's almost like the writings of the ancients. And in fact, if you're living in their world and you travel to a place like Najran or you travel to Sana'a, which people did during trade, you would have these incredibly old monuments that we're still plain to see. Monuments that go back 1,000 years or more. Mm-hmm. So a reference to those would seem more immediate and more powerful to the audience. In Safaitic, for example, the most common words for writing the verbs is safara, sifr, right, which you get in the Quran, or khutut, khatta. So they would use writing occasionally, but most of the time they were using these verbs. But it's in the Nabatean tradition.
But you have the kataba.
Where, yes, kataba, and oftentimes, so there is a very nice Nabatean inscription from Wadi Ram, and from this inscription it's called the Jabal Ram inscription. We can know the name of Wadi Ram in southern Jordan. Its ancient name was Iram. So the guy signs his name and he says Bi Iram Kitab Yaduh, or Yedeh. I don't know how to vocalize it and what language he was even writing in. It could have been Aramaic or Arabic, but so he says he writes his name Habibo, and he is at Iram, Bi Iram, and then Kitab Yaduh, the writing of his hand. And there you see that kitab just simply refers to the writing. Absolutely.
So if I can read through the lines, no pun intended, about Qiriana and Quran, there's maybe no reason to think of the technical Christian Syriac Qiriana when we think of Arabic Quran. It's better thought of as a natural development within Arabic and its earlier integration of Aramaic words.
Well, I think my colleague Marijn van Putten would argue that the Hamza there would speak against a recent loan.
Okay.
So he would say that would speak to it being already a part of the Arabic language. But let's say you're an Arabic speaker and you have this word Quran, and you also know what Qiriana is, it's not hard to associate both. And so the use of a term in this context may suggest awareness of what Qiriana meant in Syriac, but the use of a local word.
Right, because that's the key question that interests people is, was the Prophet aware that he was producing a scripture that could be used analogously in liturgical settings, like the lectionary was used for Christians. Well, speaking of Christians and linguistic riddles, one of the most famous ones is the question of the name of Jesus in the Quran. And you've written about this, so I'll just introduce the problem a little bit, and then I know you've given a long presentation. I would direct viewers to that. I think that was with ACOR, is that right? Where you gave a lecture available online, perhaps?
That's correct, yes.
Yeah, so I would invite people to look ACOR and Ahmed's presentation there. But maybe we just revisit briefly and present the problem. So the name for Jesus in the Quran is Isa, which has this Ain consonant at the beginning of the word, whereas in other Semitic languages, including in Hebrew, the Ain for the name of Jesus is at the end of the word. Now, some people just assume, well, there's something I flipped around, or maybe there was transmission in some dialect in which the Ain, like Eastern Aramaic, where the Ain is not pronounced in a way that's distinct. But it seems to be a completely different word. And, so it just so happens that it sounds very similar. So the Christian Arabic Yeshua and the Quranic Arabic Isa, they sound similar because they both have a sin in there. They both have an ayn, but the ayn is in different places. But they seem to be just different words. And you correct me if I get something wrong here. And people have said things, well, the Quran likes rhyming names. And so you have things like Yajuj wa Majuj, you have Talut and Jalut, you have other Idris and Iblis. And so maybe you just have Isa wa Musa, sort of the two great prophets. And so the Quran wanted to have a long sound at the end to rhyme Isa with Musa. And who knows why, but it has an ayn at the beginning. Anyway, so it's a really interesting problem. You know, in contemporary Middle East, it's curious that, you know, you have Christians speaking about Jesus as Yeshua, Muslims speaking about Jesus as Isa, although sometimes Christians in places like Jordan will take the name Isa, the Quranic version, as a personal name. But we have a key bit of evidence that you've discovered that may help us solve the problem. So anyway, that's my setup, and yeah, maybe you take it from there.
Yes, thank you very much. Well, I'm always averse to sort of explanations that rely on things like ignorance to explain a historical puzzle, or ad hoc series of mutations that are all, of course, post hoc, I should say, post hoc explanations that are ultimately untestable. So what we say, for example, the Quranic word Isa comes from a Eastern Aramaic dialect that had Isho, without an ayn at the end.
Right.
And then we have to posit this series of random changes that don't seem to occur anywhere else in any of the other names, that they're completely ad hoc. We've just basically created an explanation as complex as the problem. And it's impossible to test. One thing I noticed working on Safaitic, though, a few years ago, in fact, before this discovery, was that the name Ain Sin Ya, and note that Safaitic does not write long vowels inside of a word, that Ain Sin Ya occurred as a personal name in Safaitic. This was a name that individuals could have. A person might be called Ain Sin Ya bin something else. And that ya at the end is very important, because when we look at the way Isa's name is spelled in Arabic, it's not with an alif at the end. It's Ain Sin Ya. It's Ain Ya Sin Ya. What we call an alif maqsura bi surat al-ya is really a ya at the end of a word that some Quranic reading traditions instruct you to pronounce as an alif. But for example, Al-Kisai pronounces the name Al-Isay with an A vowel, right? They call that imala, but that A vowel, these alif maksuras are in fact, if we look at their occurrences etymologically, they always go back to A and Aya sounds. So they are actually more originally A vowels. And it's some reading traditions that have just merged those two sounds together. So what we feel comfortable with as normative classical Arabic, it doesn't have an A vowel anymore. But if you were to read the Quran in the tradition of Al-Kisai, for example, you will have A vowels everywhere, because alif maksuras give you these A's. Mm-hmm. So I noticed that name, but that could have just been a happy coincidence. Then during our summer expedition, 2019 summer expedition in the Harra, and there you end up documenting one thing you can't do, unfortunately, on the field is read inscriptions.
And the Harra is northern Jordan, southern Syria. Is that right?
Yes, precisely. So we were in that area surveying for Safaitic inscriptions, and we document them, but what we can't do on the field is read them, because there's not enough time. If you use your time on the field reading inscriptions, you can document fewer things.
Yes.
So we end up documenting all of this. And then, so it was about, several months later that I'm at home editing and working through everything we found, that I found the most peculiar invocation. It was a normal Safaitic inscription. It was a man, he was grieving for a loved one. And usually after grieving, authors will add a prayer to the ancient gods usually. But this prayer was Ha Ain Sin Ya, and then insurhu min kafirika. So, Ain Sin Ya, unsur, help him, who, me, against, kafara, and then a ka at the end, which must be something like kafirika or kuffarika or what have you. Help him against those who disbelieve in you. Mm-hmm. And it was so it's not only just Ain Sin Ya, but it's also the use of the root, the prayer being from Nasara and against the kafara.
Mm-hmm. It's a strongly Quranic language. And
absolutely. And so,
and remember just the passage, sorry to interrupt, but I mean,
yes,
even the passages of the Quran that involve Jesus, and we see Ansar and Nasara for example, in Surah Al-Saf and elsewhere, in Surah Al-Imran as well. Yeah.
Precisely. And so exactly. So it was entirely it was a typical Safidic inscription, except it invoked a God that we had never seen before in the tens of thousands of inscriptions we know. And the prayer was unique too, compared to the tens of thousands of inscriptions we know. So putting all of these things together, I said, well, this is pretty good evidence that this Ain Sin Ya would correspond to what we think of as Isa, or the name of Jesus in the Quran, and that this is perhaps our first clearly Christian Safidic inscription. And so then the idea is, well, we know that in the 3rd, 4th century, you have pious men, ascetics, going out to the desert and missionizing among the nomads. What would happen when they convert a group of nomads to Christianity? Well, I think 2 things happen. One, they graft the new upon the old, which is they continue writing inscriptions, but the language of those inscriptions changes. The deity changes as well, but I think that they chose this name Isa for Jesus based on 2 things. One, you notice it's already superficially similar to Yeshua. There is a similarity to it, although it's not the exact.
And I forgot to mention too, I keep on interrupting you. I'm being a bad conversation partner, but you're gracious with me. I'm just to mention that, I mean, Yeshua, coming from Yeshua in Hebrew, means something like the Lord saves. Is that?
Yes.
Just to get that up.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, precisely. And so it sounds similar to the word Yeshua. It's phonosemantic matching, where impressionistically this word sounds similar to something else, but it also means something very interesting. The root Ain Sin Ya in the languages of ancient Arabia means to purchase or to redeem. And so not only does it sound, so you have phonosemantic matching, it matches the sound, it approximates the sound, but it also captures the meaning. And it's a way of localizing perhaps Christianity in this context. But what that would mean is that Jesus was being called Isa or Isa centuries before Islam. That this was a name that
is something like, sorry, again, but in Arabic, I mean, Christians were referred to Christ as El-Fadi, the Redeemer, the one who purchases our lives, and yes.
Precisely. So it would be an epithet in that respect. Yes. And so Isa, of course, appears in the Quran without any explanation. No one has to say that this is the name of Christ. The audience knew this was the name of Christ. This was the name of Jesus. So the Quran itself suggests that this name already had some, that its audience knew what it was. And if this identification is correct, that would make sense because it was there already in Arabic centuries before its appearance in the Quran.
It's great. It's fascinating. Yeah. There have been so many theories about this. I just remember the theory that, it's related to the Hebrew word for Esau, the brother of Jacob, because the Jews of Medina scornfully would refer to Jesus this way, and Muhammad didn't pick up on that, so he just. Right. So there's so many sort of wild theories out there. With this is actually based on evidence. Yeah.
That's the importance of fossils. You see, this is part of the very beginning where we're attracted to fossils because they turn prehistory into history.
Yes.
And we're not left with this kind of circular speculation.
Right.
The Jesus article, the Isa article, it will appear in the next issue of Jigsaw. So I should mention that.
Yeah, Journal of the International Quranic Studies Association. Well, I've tried your patience. I really want to get on to one point that's super, super exciting that I want to make sure we touch on before we finish. And that's your recent visit to Saudi Arabia and being in the field there. And yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just let you introduce what you're up to in Saudi Arabia and what you found
there. Yes, well, we're just we're looking for fossils in the area of Taif, which is a very important
not
town.
Pre-Cambrian, but linguistic fossils.
Yes, precisely. Pre-Islamic, I should say. Pre-Islamic fossils.
Okay.
Yes, and so we're looking for these in the area of Taif, which is a very important town east of Mecca. Agricultural town to the south. I mean, it's an amazing and a very important place. Yet on our epigraphic maps, it's barely documented. We don't have good information from these areas. So a lot of people confuse gaps on maps with gaps in evidence. meaning that there's just nothing there. And that's not the truth. When you look at these maps and you see gaps in epigraphic documentation, it means that these areas haven't been thoroughly surveyed. It's not that there's nothing there, it's that we don't know what's there. So I remember the way that this started, I was talking with Sean Anthony, and I said, Sean, if you could go anywhere in Arabia to survey, Sean Anthony is my colleague, who's of course a well-known scholar of early Islam. I said, if you could go anywhere in Arabia to survey, where would it be? He said, Taif. I said, okay, well then we'll go to Taif. And that's how it started. And we started survey. I went with my colleague, Dr. Haytham Sidqi, and we started a survey, just comprehensive, looking at anything, documenting modern graffiti, early Islamic, pre-Islamic, Thamudic, even prehistoric Neolithic rock art. Everything that is found must be documented. We need to know everything that exists. It's very slow, and sometimes the point of doing that isn't obvious, but I'll come back to why it is in the end. And so one of the things that you can do with inscriptions is you can figure out where people are going and where they're coming from. You can reconstruct routes of movements by following the trail of inscriptions. And so we did that around Taif, around Mecca, and especially in the ancient times, the Thamudic stuff. What we were able to see based on putting all these inscriptions on the map is that you have a very nice trail, going from Taif west, leading into Mecca of inscriptions. And you have a nice trail south, going north to Mecca in Thamudic inscriptions. So there's movement in this kind of direction. Now, most of these inscriptions are just people's names. They're just graffiti. Ancient people 2,000 years ago saying, what most of them are people longing for their loved ones. So my name is so and so, and I be a shawq. There's longing in me for someone else, right? One of them said be a shawq ila Fadi. So some guy called Fadi. He's feeling longing for Fadi. This kind of stuff. So again, on their own, they're not necessarily historically important. But once you start mapping them, putting them on a map, you can see where these guys are going. In fact, we found this is a great story. We went and surveyed in an area north of Taif, and Wadi there, and we found this beautiful carving of a bull, monumental, must have been almost a meter and a half tall, with a gazelle and lions. It was a really beautiful religious scene, and the person who wrote the inscription signed it. Hafara, or his name Hafara, and his name was Awalak or something like this, a very strange ancient name. And then we continued in the Wadi and we found two more inscriptions of the same guy. So we could say that he was either going north or coming south. And then so we work hard. We leave in the morning around 6 and we come back at sunset. And when we get back at sunset, we eat and we think about the next day and what we're going to do and everything of that sort. So we got back and we were just watching. We were on YouTube just writing, trying to find anyone who's seen anything around Taif, YouTube, inscriptions from this area. And some guys had claimed to have found an inscription of one of Abraha's soldiers. And there's like, it's here.
The Yemeni, originally Ethiopian, but a Yemeni king who leads an expedition towards Mecca.
Precisely.
Or in the 570.
Yes, precisely. So they said, this is an inscription of a soldier because it was drawn next to a big man. And then we went and I was watching the YouTube videos, and I pushed pause. I'm like, hold on, I know this guy. This is the same guy we saw up there because I saw his inscription on YouTube. Where is this place? We listened to it. We asked locals where this place would be, whatever. We went up and found it and documented it. So we had 3 points.
Wow.
And I found him on YouTube. I just recognized his name, right, from the video. I was like, I know this man. He has such a strange name. And the same again, Hafara. So we documented it. So we knew that he was coming from the north, going to Taif. And then here's the frustrating thing. We get back, and all of a sudden appears on the internet some of these treasure hunters, whatever. There's no treasure. Everyone should stop destroying archaeological sites looking for treasure. There's no treasure. I know I'm speaking into the wind, but it's important to say that. But one of these treasure hunters on Twitter posted another picture of an inscription they said has to do with treasure. And it was the guy again. It was the same guy. And we found out that it was west of Taif. So there's we don't know the direction he's moving or coming, but there's a clear movement from west of Taif to north of Taif, then all the way northeast. You can track movements like this with the inscriptions, and you can say something about where people are going and what. Of course, it's not a question as to why anyone would want to go to Taif. It's paradise, right? And so you can see how that's moving. Now, another thing comes out. We can talk about density. So while the inscriptions show that people are moving in the direction of Mecca in pre-Islamic times, and this is something that's been noticed by previous scholars who've just done some surveys in the area, the density of inscriptions comparatively speaking, when we look at other big sites like Najran, when we look at sites like Dumat al-Jandal or the North al-Hijr, there are so much fewer inscriptions. There's so much fewer. That's not a way of speaking. Sorry about that. The inscriptions, there are far less inscriptions and far fewer inscriptions in this area than we find in other places, which suggests that the area in ancient times maybe didn't receive as much traffic at other places, or that writing wasn't as well known.
But about between Ta'if and Mecca, this area.
That's right. Yes, precisely. The traffic there's and all around it, there was much less traffic as when we compare to other parts of the peninsula.
That's really interesting. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Right. And yeah. So of all of this, we don't have to make applications now. We can stick with the evidence, which we know by now is your MO. So, but it's fascinating to see, I guess, a lower density of inscriptions in this area. What about the religious nature of some of the inscriptions you found? I imagine it differs depending on the projected or provisional dating of the inscriptions, but what can you say from that perspective?
So unfortunately, with the Thamudic inscriptions, we are completely lost in time. We have no chronological anchor for the Thamudic inscriptions to be able to tell us when exactly they were carved. The most we can do is compare their letter shapes with other corpora and make some assumptions like that. So the inscriptions around Taif and near Mecca are similar in their style to the inscriptions around the northern Hijaz, central Hijaz, like around Yathrib and further north. There's only one dated inscription from that area, and it dates to 267 CE. Okay. So it's and we can't really extrapolate. We have no idea. So we're sort of lost in time when it comes to the Thamudic inscriptions. We can simply say that they're pre-Islamic, but whether they're 500 years, 1,000 years, it's impossible to say. But what's fascinating is all the Thamudic inscriptions we documented, not a single religious invocation. If you were to take them on face value,
a lot of longing, but not a lot of longing for a god or a god.
Yes, precisely. They're secular, they're worldly, which contrasts with Safavidic, for example, or even in the north, the Thamudic inscriptions from Hayil in the Najd north. They are filled with religious statements. Every other inscription is invoking some god or another, whereas here they're not, which is very interesting. But when you move to the 6th century, we document 6th century Arabic script inscriptions.
Right.
The Arabic script, these are inscriptions that paleographically fit in the, let's say, century before Islam, or can also be contemporary with early Islam, the beginnings of Islam. These texts continue the trend that we see across the Arabian Peninsula, that they have a monotheistic vocabulary. There's no invocation to the ancient gods, but rather they're invoking the one God, using terms like Al-Ilah, using terms like Allah, using terms like Rabb. And this is so the area around Taif basically is in line with the trend that we see everywhere. So there's a huge, relatively huge. 30 years ago, if you opened up an article on Arabic script inscriptions before Islam, there were 4 maybe. Mm-hmm. Now there's probably around 40. So the corpus is expanding and it continues to grow. Mm-hmm. And of this, anytime there's any information that has to do with religious identity, it is, broadly speaking, monotheistic. And what do I mean by monotheistic is that it does not mention the ancient gods that we know so well from the pre-Islamic inscriptions.
We could say with some degree of confidence, now that we have more than just a handful of inscriptions, that monotheism arrives to the Arabian Peninsula. And now with your work, even to the Central Arabian Peninsula. not with Islam, but before Islam.
I would say that, and of course, that's the Quran is obviously the witness to the same thing, because the Quran is engaging with a monotheistic audience too. So what we are actually finding now is very much in line with the picture of Arabia that we get from the Quran. It's no surprise. It is the picture. It contrasts with the picture of Arabia that we get in, for example, Kitab al-Asnam from Ibn al-Kalbi. That picture of Arabia,
sort of idolatrous pagan culture.
Yes, precisely. Because you see, we could put the area of Taif aside, but when we look at other places, for example, like Dumat al-Jandal was supposedly the center of the worship of Wad, as we get in the Kitab al-Asnam. But the inscriptions available to us from Dumat al-Jandal show that before Islam, their main deity was called Al-Ilah, the God.
Yeah, the God. And
they like to put crosses on the inscriptions as well.
Which is it's actually a little hint of something.
And what's even just as I love the case of Dumat al-Jandal as a laboratory, because see, Dumat al-Jandal has an uninterrupted epigraphic documentation that stretches back to the middle of the first millennium BCE. And it documents the pagan phase where they had all these gods and everything. And then, of course, the transition to Al-Ilah. Okay, so that's all there in the fossil record. Who is the god who was never invoked at Dumat al-Jandal anytime in the pre-Islamic period is Wad.
That's incredible.
He never was there. Wad was in ancient Yemen. Yeah, Wad was in ancient Yemen.
Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah, as you said, it seems to me that this lines up with the Quran's engagement with monotheism. Even in, if someone follows the chronology and likes to divide the Quran between Meccan and Medinan surahs, also in the Meccan surahs, there's engagement with Judaism and Christianity and Jewish and Christian ideas. But it does, in textbooks, we tend to read that, Arabia was the last pagan island in a sea of monotheism in the Middle East. And this is really, really important for helping us nuance that picture. And it's important too, not only for the study of Islam's origins, but also for the history of Christianity in the Middle East. Presumably Judaism too, but a number of the inscriptions, as you mentioned, are explicitly Christian. And so, they give us a sense of presumably missionary activity that was, even if perhaps, not sure where you stand on this question, even if the Bible was perhaps not yet translated into Arabic, there was still missionary activity, it seems, and Christian communities in Arabia.
I would add one thing to that. We have to always remember also that pagan is not a term of self-identification. And so, when we have the diffusion of biblically inspired monotheism, we can say, to different parts of Arabia, we don't know what they did with their ancient gods. Was there a period where they became monotheists, but relegated, and this is an idea that's in the literature as well, relegated the ancient gods to subordinate roles under the new monotheistic god? Or did they, for example, think that transform them into spirits, or did they abandon them altogether? That much is not clear yet from the inscriptional evidence. So, but when we do get terms like pagan, this is of course always put on people from a purist point of view, from a point of view of, let's say, real monotheism.
I think I've been called a pagan before. I'm sure of it, actually.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Terrific. Well, I'm so grateful for your generosity with time and wisdom, and it's great to learn from you, Ahmad. Thank you so much. Do you want to mention any things you have going on now, future projects, next steps in your academic journey?
Well, I'll just mention two things. The first is that the second edition of the Safvidic grammar should be released sometime next year, first half of next year. And another book that will be released open access in February of 2022 is The Religion and Rituals of the Nomads of Pre-Islamic Arabia, a reconstruction based on the Safvidic inscriptions. So what this book attempts to do is reconstruct traditional Arabian religion, reconstruct reconstruct Arabian paganism, not by the impressions of outside writers, not as it's remembered in the Islamic times, but by practitioners of this belief system's texts themselves.
Great. Terrific. Yeah. Great. Well, I'd really encourage everyone to follow Professor Al-Jallad's work. And also, thanks for being here on this channel. Take a moment to like and subscribe to Exploring the Quran and the Bible. And Ahmed, this was great. Thank you so much, and best wishes for your next steps.
Thank you.
Well, friends, thanks for being with us for this episode of Exploring the Quran and the Bible. I hope you found it to be an edifying discussion. I really hope that you find generally the content on this channel to be useful. There's a really diverse range of things in regard to Quranic studies and biblical studies with top-notch scholars. And we'll be really grateful for your support. So please don't hesitate to like the videos, starting with this one maybe, to subscribe to the channel and to share the news with your friends about exploring the Quran and the Bible.